The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floor as James Washington made his way through the bustling terminal. It was just past 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the airport hummed with activity. Business travelers clutching coffee cups, families caroling sleepy children, and airline staff moving with purpose through the crowds. James adjusted the strap of his laptop bag and checked his watch. He had plenty of time before his flight to San Francisco, where he was scheduled to present his team's new software to potential investors. After 12 years in the tech industry and countless business trips, airports had become like a second home to him. Another day, another flight, he thought, sipping the last of his coffee before tossing the cup into a nearby recycling bin. At 35, James had worked his way up from a junior programmer to lead engineer at one of the country's most promising tech startups. His hard work had earned him not just professional respect, but also the perks that came with it, including the executive platinum frequent flyer status that allowed him to breeze through security in the priority lane just minutes earlier. The security checkpoint had been routine. James had his ritual down to a science. Laptop out, shoes off, belt removed, all before most people had even reached for their bins. The TSA agent had barely glanced at him as he passed through the scanner without issue, just as he had hundreds of times before. Now, rolling his carry-on suitcase, a gift from his team after securing their last major client, James headed toward Concourse B. He planned to stop at his favorite breakfast spot near Gate B23 before settling in to review his presentation one last time. The airport was particularly crowded today. A storm system moving up the East Coast had caused delays and cancellations, packing the terminals with frustrated travelers. James navigated through the crowds with practiced ease, weaving between slow-moving groups and sliding past people glued to their phones. He paused to help an elderly woman retrieve her fallen boarding pass, earning a warm smile and a patted hand on his arm before continuing on his way. These small human moments were what made travel bearable for James, brief connections in the otherwise impersonal flow of airport life. As he approached the moving walkway that would take him to his concourse, James noticed a uniformed officer leaning against a pillar, watching the passing travelers with a stern expression. Officer Michael Reynolds had been with the airport police for 12 years and prided himself on what he called his sixth sense for trouble. Today, his attention fixed firmly on James. James didn't notice the officer's gaze at first. He was busy responding to a text from his project manager about last-minute changes to their presentation. But as he stepped onto the moving walkway, a prickle of awareness made him look up. The officer had straightened from his casual pose and was now following parallel to the walkway, keeping pace and watching him intently. Strange, James thought, unconsciously checking his pockets to make sure he had everything. He'd done nothing wrong, had his boarding pass checked, cleared security, and was simply heading to his gate like hundreds of other passengers around him. Still, years of living as a black man in America had taught James to notice when he was being watched. It was a familiar discomfort, that sensation of eyes following you without reason. He took a deep breath and focused on staying calm. Probably nothing, he told himself. Just head to your gate and grab breakfast. As James stepped off the walkway and turned toward the food court, he saw the officer change direction, cutting through the crowd with deliberate steps. The man's face had hardened with purpose, and he was now clearly heading straight for James. Around them, the airport continued its normal morning rhythm. Announcements echoed overhead. Travelers rushed to gates. Baristas called out completed orders. But for James, everything suddenly seemed to slow down. His routine travel day was about to become anything but routine, and he had no idea that in the next few minutes, his ordinary Tuesday would become the flashpoint for a controversy that would change multiple lives forever. James considered the question. Part of him wanted to just get on his flight and leave this whole ugly incident behind. But another part, the part that remembered every unfair stop, every suspicious glance, every time he'd been made to feel less than, knew this was important. Yes, he said finally. Use the footage. Just, he hesitated, let me know what happens. Winters nodded, understanding the weight behind his simple request. You have my word. This doesn't end with you just walking away. Things are going to change because of what happened today. The first boarding call for James's flight to San Francisco echoed through the terminal. As he gathered his belongings, James wondered if she was right, if real change was possible from one incident on one ordinary Tuesday morning. James's flight to San Francisco was smooth, but his mind was anything but. As the plane crossed over the Rockies, he replayed the morning's events again and again. The airline's weak coffee sat untouched beside his laptop as he tried to focus on his presentation, the words blurring before his eyes. His phone buzzed the moment he turned it on after landing. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Washington, this is Dr. Winters. Things are moving quickly. Can you talk?" Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, the airport's administrative offices were in an uproar. In a glass-walled conference room, Airport Director Thomas Chen paced as he watched the body camera footage for the third time. Each viewing only deepened the furrow between his brows. "Play it again," he said to Dr. Winters, who sat calmly at the table. "I want to be absolutely certain before we proceed." Winters nodded, though she knew the footage wouldn't suddenly reveal something different. Beside her sat Chief of Airport Police Robert Gonzalez, his face a mask of professional control despite the anger simmering beneath. As the video played, showing Officer Reynolds grabbing James's arm and making comments about his watch and luggage, Gonzalez shook his head slowly. "That's enough," Chen said, stopping the footage. "I've seen what I needed to see." He turned to face the window overlooking the runways, hands clasped behind his back. "We've been getting complaints about profiling for months. I had hoped your new policies would address the issue gradually, Dr. Winters." "Sometimes change needs to be immediate, not gradual," she replied. Chen turned back to face them. "I agree, especially now that we have clear evidence. The passenger videos are already circulating online, though thankfully none show his face clearly. Still, this could become a PR nightmare if we don't act decisively." "This isn't just about PR," Winters said firmly. "It's about doing what's right." Chen nodded. "In this case, they're the same thing." He looked at Gonzalez. "Chief, what's your recommendation?" Gonzalez didn't hesitate. "Immediate administrative leave pending termination." Reynolds violated at least 6 department policies in that 4-minute interaction. There's no defending it. "I agree," Chen said. "Make it happen today." Across town, Officer Reynolds sat in his living room, staring at his silent phone. He'd been expecting a call from his union rep, not the formal notice of administrative leave that had arrived by email instead. 12 years on the force and now this. All because of that stuck-up Dr. Winters and her cameras. All because he'd been doing his job, keeping an eye on suspicious characters. That's what he told himself anyway. His wife walked in, concern etched on her face. "Michael? What's going on? You've been staring at nothing for an hour." Before he could answer, his phone finally rang. It was Chief Gonzalez himself, not a union rep or HR. The conversation was brief and to the point. When it ended, Reynolds sat in stunned silence. "Michael?" His wife repeated. "Who was that?" "The chief," he said, his voice hollow. "I'm done. They're pushing for termination, not just suspension. They have video." Back at the airport, Dr. Winters was drafting an official apology to James when her assistant knocked on her door. "The videos are going viral," he said without preamble. 3 different angles now, all over social media. The hashtag Airport Justice is trending locally. Winters sighed. Was bound to happen. At least Mr. Washington's face isn't clearly visible in any of them. "Actually, that's not the focus of the conversation online," her assistant said, showing her his tablet. "People are praising the airport's immediate response. One passenger's post says, 'Watched racial profiling happen in real time, then watched that officer get shot down by a boss who wasn't having it. Faith in humanity slightly restored.'" Across the country, James sat in his San Francisco hotel room, watching the same videos on his laptop. It was surreal seeing himself in the footage, yet also strangely validating. The call with Dr. Winters had been brief but impactful. Officer Reynolds was already on administrative leave. An official investigation had been launched. The airport's leadership was unanimous in their condemnation of what had happened. A knock at his hotel room door interrupted his thoughts. Room service with the dinner he barely remembered ordering. As he signed the receipt, the server glanced at the video still playing on his laptop. "Man, did you see that? It's all over Twitter," the young man said. "About time someone got caught on camera. That stuff happens every day. James just nodded, not ready to say, "That's me in the video." Instead, he simply added a generous tip and thanked the server. When the door closed, James sat back down and opened his email. A formal apology from the Atlanta Airport Authority sat in his inbox, along with a request for a meeting when he returned. For the first time since the incident, he felt something shift inside him, a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. James felt his stomach tighten as the officer approached. He'd done nothing wrong, yet experience had taught him that didn't always matter. Keeping his expression neutral, he slowed his pace and prepared for the interaction. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass and ID," Officer Reynolds said, his voice sharp enough to turn nearby heads. He stood uncomfortably close, hand resting on his belt near his taser. James blinked, momentarily confused. He'd already gone through security and had his documents checked twice. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely, conscious of keeping his voice steady and non-threatening. "Just comply with my request, sir," Reynolds replied, emphasizing the word "sir" in a way that stripped it of any respect. His eyes darted to James's expensive carry-on luggage and designer watch. A small crowd began to form at a distance, travelers slowing their hurried pace to watch the scene unfold. An older couple exchanged glances, the woman whispering something to her husband. A businessman in a suit frowned, checking his watch but not moving on. "Of course," James said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. He'd learned years ago that sudden movements could be dangerous in situations like this. "I'm just a bit confused because I've already cleared security and—" "I don't need your commentary," Reynolds cut him off. "Just the documents." A flight attendant rolling her suitcase nearby slowed her pace, clearly listening. Two teenage girls had stopped completely, one nudging the other and pointing discreetly at the scene. James handed over his ID and boarding pass, keeping his movements deliberate and calm despite the humiliation burning in his chest. The terminal suddenly felt too bright, too public, as if a spotlight had been placed on this unwanted interaction. Reynolds examined the documents with exaggerated scrutiny, flipping the ID card over several times and holding it up to the light as if checking for forgery. "Where are you headed today, Mr. Washington?" "San Francisco." "Business trip," James answered simply, though the question was clearly answered by the boarding pass in the officer's hand. "And what kind of business would that be?" Reynolds pressed, eyes narrowing. The crowd had grown, with at least a dozen people now openly watching. A man in a business suit had taken out his phone, holding it at chest level in a way that suggested he might be recording. "I'm a software engineer," James replied, leading a presentation for potential investors. He considered adding the name of his company but decided against it. He shouldn't have to prove his legitimacy to someone who had no right to question him in the first place. Reynolds handed back the ID but kept the boarding pass. "That's some expensive luggage for an engineer," he remarked, nodding toward James's carry-on. "Gift from your company." The implication was clear, and it stung. James took a deep breath, determined not to give the officer any reason to escalate. "Yes, it was a gift from my team after closing a major deal last year." "Must be nice," Reynolds said with a smirk. He finally returned the boarding pass, but made no move to leave. "Where'd you fly in from today?" "I didn't fly in," James explained, his patience wearing thin despite his efforts. "I live here in Atlanta. I'm departing, not arriving." Reynolds crossed his arms. "So what gate are you headed to in such a hurry?" "B-23, James replied, increasingly aware of the growing audience. A mother had pulled her curious child closer, whispering something in his ear. Two airport employees at a nearby gate were watching with concerned expressions. "Mind if I check your bag?" Reynolds asked, though it sounded more like a demand than a question. This had gone far enough. James straightened his shoulders slightly. "Actually, officer, I do mind. I've already been through security, my documents are in order, and I haven't done anything to warrant this level of scrutiny. If there's a specific reason you've stopped me, I'd like to know what it is." Reynolds' face hardened. "Are you refusing to cooperate with airport security, sir?" "I'm not refusing anything," James clarified calmly. "I'm simply asking why I'm being singled out when I followed all proper procedures." "I decide who gets additional screening," Reynolds snapped, his voice rising enough that people several yards away turned to look. "And right now, I'm deciding it's you." The tension between them was palpable now, drawing even more attention. A woman in a business suit had stopped completely, her phone now clearly recording the interaction. An airline pilot passing by slowed his walk, watching the scene with a furrowed brow. James knew this moment could go one of two ways, and he had to choose his next words carefully. The unfairness of it all burned in his throat, but getting angry would only play into the officer's hands. What he didn't know was that someone else was watching, someone whose intervention would change everything in a matter of seconds. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch as James stood facing Officer Reynolds. The terminal's background noise seemed to dim, as if the world around them was holding its breath. James could feel sweat forming at his temples despite the cool air conditioning. "Look, officer," James said, keeping his voice level, "I understand you're doing your job, but I've already been through all the proper security channels. I'm just trying to get to my gate like everyone else." Reynolds took a half step closer, invading James's personal space. "That's a nice suit you're wearing. Must have cost a pretty penny." His eyes flickered to James's watch again. "And that looks like a Rolex. Software engineering must pay better than I thought." James felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the same one he'd felt countless times before when someone implied he couldn't possibly afford the things he'd worked hard for. He'd earned every bit of his success through long nights, skipped weekends, and years of dedication to his craft. "I've worked in tech for over 12 years, James explained, though he hated feeling like he needed to justify himself. "I'm the lead engineer at my company." A woman nearby whispered loudly enough to be heard, "This doesn't look right." Her companion nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on the scene. Reynolds ignored the growing discomfort of the onlookers. "Well, Mr. Lead Engineer, I'm going to need to see what's in that fancy suitcase of yours." James stood his ground. "Officer, I've already had my luggage screened by TSA. If there was an issue, it would have been flagged then." "Are you telling me how to do my job?" Reynolds' face flushed red. "Turn around and put your hands where I can see them." A shocked murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. The man who had been recording earlier now held his phone higher, making no attempt to hide what he was doing. "This is completely unnecessary," James said, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor, please." Those words seemed to flip a switch in Reynolds. He grabbed James's arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "You don't make demands here. I'm the authority, and you'll do as I say or face the consequences." James winced but didn't pull away, knowing that could be seen as resistance. "You're hurting me, officer. Please let go of my arm." "Dad, why is that police officer being mean to that man?" A child's voice piped up from the crowd, followed by a parent's hushed response. Reynolds tightened his grip. "I can detain you for interfering with security protocols. Is that what you want? To miss your flight and spend the day in a holding cell?" James took a deep breath. In his mind, he could hear his father's voice from years ago. "Stay calm, stand tall, but never let them take your dignity." He looked Officer Reynolds directly in the eyes. "I have complied with every reasonable request. I've shown you my ID and boarding pass. I've answered your questions. But I will not be manhandled or threatened for simply trying to catch my flight. Either charge me with something specific or let me go to my gate." The airport's overhead speakers announced a final boarding call for a flight to Chicago, the normal airport business continuing around this island of tension. A group of flight attendants had stopped to watch, their expressions concerned. One of them was speaking quietly into a radio. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "You think you're special? That the rules don't apply to you? I've seen your type before, thinking your education and your fancy job puts you above the law." "That's not what I think at all," James replied. "I respect the law and the people who enforce it properly. But this isn't about security, this is about something else, and we both know it." Reynolds' face darkened. "Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Washington? Because that sounds like disrespect of authority to me." His free hand moved to his handcuffs. "Maybe you need to learn some respect." The crowd had grown larger now, with at least 20 people openly watching. Several phones were recording, and the discomfort among the onlookers was visible. A businessman checked his watch but made no move to leave, clearly invested in what was happening. "I haven't disrespected you, officer," James said, his voice somehow remaining calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "But I am requesting again to speak with your supervisor." Reynolds leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that only James could hear. "People like you always want to talk to the supervisor. Always looking for special treatment. Well, not today." He pulled the handcuffs from his belt. "Put your hands behind your back. Now." 3 months later, James stood at the podium in a conference room at Atlanta International Airport, looking out at the faces of 30 airport security officers. It still felt strange to be here, on this side of the experience, but Dr. Winters had been persistent in her requests for his help. "I'm not going to tell you how to do your jobs," James began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But I can tell you what it feels like to be on the receiving end of profiling." The room was quiet. In the back row, Dr. Winters nodded encouragingly. Beside her sat Airport Director Chen and Chief Gonzalez, both men watching intently as James shared his story. "That day changed more than just my experience at this airport," James continued. "It changed how I travel, how I dress when I travel, how early I arrive before flights. Small things that add up." A young officer in the front row raised her hand. "But how do we balance security concerns with making sure we're not profiling?" It was a fair question, and exactly why James had finally agreed to participate in this training. Not for revenge or recognition, but for change. "Focus on behavior, not appearance," James replied. "Officer Reynolds decided I was suspicious before he ever spoke to me. He made assumptions based on my race and my belongings, not on anything I actually did." Across town, in a small apartment he'd moved into after his divorce, Michael Reynolds scrolled through job listings on his laptop. The termination had been finalized 6 weeks ago, after a hearing where the video evidence left no room for defense. His wife had left shortly after, unable to handle the stress and his growing bitterness. He'd applied for security positions at 3 different companies, but a quick Google search of his name brought up dozens of news articles and videos. No one was calling back. His union had fought for him initially but backed off when more complaints surfaced from his personnel file, patterns that couldn't be ignored. Back at the airport, James was wrapping up his presentation. "The most important thing I want you to understand is the ripple effect. What might seem like a small interaction to you can change someone's entire life." An older officer spoke up from the middle of the room. "I've been doing this job for 20 years. Sometimes you just get a feeling about someone. Are you saying we should ignore our instincts?" James considered the question carefully. "I'm saying examine your instincts. Ask yourself what's really triggering that feeling. Is it actual suspicious behavior or is it something else?" Dr. Winters stepped forward. "That's exactly why we've implemented the new decision tree protocol. It requires officers to articulate specific behavioral reasons for additional screening." After the session ended, several officers stayed to speak with James personally. One apologized for similar actions he'd taken in the past. Another shared her own experiences with profiling as a Hispanic woman. Real conversations were happening, uncomfortable but necessary. In the hallway afterward, Director Chen shook James's hand. "Your presentation was excellent. Would you consider doing this quarterly for new hires?" James hadn't expected that. "I have a full-time job, sir." "We'd compensate you as a professional consultant, of course," Chen replied. "Your perspective is invaluable." Meanwhile, the changes at Atlanta International had caught national attention. A major news network had run a feature on the airport's new anti-profiling protocols, highlighting how one incident had sparked system-wide reform. Other airports were reaching out to Dr. Winters, asking about implementing similar programs. That evening, as James packed for his flight home, his phone rang. It was his sister. "Just saw you on the news again, little brother," she said, pride evident in her voice. Mom would have been so proud. James smiled at the mention of their mother, who had taught them both to stand up for what was right, but to do it with dignity. "I'm still not comfortable with all the attention," he admitted. "Well, get comfortable," his sister laughed. "My daughter's class wants you to come speak at Career Day. Apparently, you're her new hero." After hanging up, James sat on the edge of the hotel bed, taking a moment to reflect on the past 3 months. The incident itself had lasted less than 10 minutes, but its effects continued to ripple outward. A security officer had lost his career. An airport had transformed its approach to passenger screening, and James himself had found a new purpose alongside his engineering work. As he zipped his suitcase closed, James thought about his flight home tomorrow. For the first time in months, he felt no anxiety about walking through the terminal. Small steps, real change. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was progress. And sometimes that's enough to keep moving forward. James stood frozen, caught in a nightmare he couldn't escape. But in that moment, something changed in the atmosphere. Reynolds suddenly stiffened, as if sensing a presence behind him. James looked over the officer's shoulder and saw a woman approaching with purpose in her stride and authority in her expression. Dr. Elaine Winters had been having a busy morning. As the newly appointed head of security operations for Atlanta International Airport, she'd spent the past 3 weeks evaluating every aspect of the facility's security protocols. Today, she was conducting an unannounced observation of Terminal B, dressed in plain business attire rather than her usual uniform. Most of the staff didn't recognize her yet, exactly as she intended. With 20 years in law enforcement and a doctorate in criminal justice, Winters had been brought in specifically to modernize the airport's approach to security. Her first priority: addressing the complaints about racial profiling that had been piling up for months. She'd been standing near a coffee shop, making notes on her tablet about the efficiency of the security lines, when she noticed Officer Reynolds following a well-dressed black man through the terminal. Something about the officer's body language triggered her professional instincts. She closed her tablet and began to observe more carefully. As the confrontation unfolded, Winters felt a cold anger building inside her. She'd seen this pattern too many times in her career. When Reynolds grabbed the traveler's arm, she started recording on her department-issued body camera, cleverly designed to look like an ordinary lapel pin. Then she began moving toward them, catching pieces of the conversation as she approached. "Put your hands behind your back, now." Reynolds's command carried clearly through the hushed terminal. "Excuse me, Officer Reynolds," Winters said firmly, stepping into view. "I need you to release that gentleman immediately." Reynolds turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. He didn't recognize her. "Ma'am, this is a security matter. I need you to step back and—" "I'm not asking, officer," Winters cut him off, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. She pulled out her ID badge. "Dr. Elaine Winters, head of security operations for this airport. And I've been watching this entire interaction." The color drained from Reynolds's face as he released his grip on James's arm. The crowd murmured, sensing the sudden shift in power. Someone whispered, "Oh snap," and another voice replied, "This just got real." "Sir," Winters said, turning to James with a completely different tone, "I want to apologize for this unprofessional conduct. Are you all right?" James rubbed his arm where Reynolds's fingers had dug in. "I'm fine," he said, though the slight tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. "Just trying to get to my flight." Winters nodded, then turned back to Reynolds, whose expression had transformed from aggressive to defensive. "Officer, I need your badge number and your supervisor's contact information." She held up her hand when he began to protest. "And before you speak, you should know that I've been recording this encounter as part of my departmental assessment." A woman in the crowd clapped once, then quickly covered her mouth. The tension in the air had transformed into something else, a collective holding of breath as justice appeared to unfold before them. "I was just doing my job," Reynolds insisted, straightening his uniform. This individual was behaving suspiciously and— "I observed this gentleman for 5 full minutes before you approached him," Winters interrupted, her voice level but intense. "He was checking his phone and walking to his gate like hundreds of other passengers. There was nothing suspicious about his behavior whatsoever." An airport janitor who had stopped to watch nodded in agreement, leaning on his broom. "Furthermore," Winters continued, "I heard you commenting on his clothing and watch, questioning how he could afford them. That has nothing to do with security protocols." James stood a little straighter, the validation washing over him like a wave of relief. For once, someone in authority had seen the truth. Reynolds's face flushed red again, but now from embarrassment rather than anger. "With all due respect, Dr. Winters, you're new here. You don't understand how things work on the ground. We have to make judgment calls." "I understand exactly how things should work," Winters cut him off again. "And this isn't it. She turned to James. "Sir, if you're willing, I'd like to get a statement from you about this incident. But first, what time is your flight? I want to make sure you don't miss it because of this unacceptable delay." The humanity of her concern, so different from Reynolds's treatment, caught James by surprise. "It boards in 40 minutes. Gate B23. Perfect. We have time." Winters turned to Reynolds, who stood rigid with barely contained fury. "Officer, you are relieved for the remainder of your shift. Report to my office at 3 p.m. Your supervisor will be present." As Reynolds opened his mouth to argue, Winters added quietly, "That wasn't a suggestion, it was an order." The crowd began to disperse, many people nodding in approval as they returned to their travels. As Reynolds stalked away, James realized he was witnessing something rare and powerful, accountability happening in real time. With Officer Reynolds gone, the air around Gate B23 seemed lighter somehow. James sat in a quiet corner of the waiting area, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside him as Dr. Winters finished typing notes on her tablet. "I think that covers everything for now," she said, looking up from her screen. "I'm truly sorry this happened to you, Mr. Washington." James nodded, still processing the whirlwind of emotions from the past hour. "Thank you for stepping in. Not everyone would have." "More people should," Winters replied simply. She tucked her tablet into her bag and leaned forward slightly. "What happened to you today wasn't just wrong, it was against every protocol we have. Officer Reynolds had no cause to stop you, question you, or put his hands on you." A few seats away, an elderly man pretended to read his newspaper while listening intently to their conversation. Two teenage girls nearby weren't even pretending not to listen, their curious eyes darting between James and Winters. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened to me," James admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "Just the first time anyone with authority saw it and did something about it." Winters's expression hardened. "Well, I saw it, and I have the evidence right here." She tapped the small camera pin on her lapel. "The footage is already uploaded to our secure server. It can't be deleted or altered." James hadn't noticed the camera before. "You record everything." "Part of our new transparency initiative," she explained. "I was already conducting observations today. When I saw Officer Reynolds following you, something didn't feel right, so I activated the recording." She hesitated before adding, "His behavior matches several complaints we've received about him in recent months." And nothing was done. James couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "Nothing concrete," Winters admitted, clearly frustrated herself. "Complaints without evidence are too easily dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. That's why I pushed for these body cameras when I took this position 3 weeks ago." The boarding announcement for a flight to Dallas crackled over the speakers, momentarily drawing attention away from their conversation. When it ended, Winters continued. "Mr. Washington, I know you have a flight to catch, but I want to assure you that this incident won't be swept under the rug. The footage clearly shows racial profiling and abuse of authority. Those are firing offenses under our new policies." James raised his eyebrows. "New policies?" "My first official act as head of security," Winters said with a small smile. "Zero tolerance for profiling. Some of the old guard aren't happy about it, but today proves exactly why it's necessary." A woman across from them suddenly looked up from her phone. "Excuse me," she said, surprising both James and Winters. "I recorded what happened too. Would it help if I sent you my video?" Winters turned to her. "That would be extremely helpful, yes." The woman nodded. "I travel through this airport twice a month, and I've seen that officer hassle people before. Always people of color, never anyone who looks like me." She held up her phone. "I started recording as soon as I saw him grab this gentleman's arm. Just didn't know who to send it to until now." James felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. The woman hadn't spoken up during the confrontation, but she hadn't been a passive bystander either. She documented it, waiting for a chance to help. "Thank you," he said simply. The woman smiled. "I should be thanking you for how you handled yourself. My husband's a lawyer, and he always says the calmer person wins. You were definitely the calmer person." As Winters collected the woman's contact information, James checked his watch. 20 minutes until boarding. His phone buzzed with a text from his project manager, all set for the presentation tomorrow. The ordinary question from his ordinary life felt surreal after what had just happened. He started to type yes, then paused and wrote instead, "Had a situation at the airport. I'll call you when I land and explain." "Mr. Washington," Winters said, returning her attention to him, "there's something else you should know. This footage will need to be reviewed by airport administration and law enforcement leadership. Are you comfortable with that?"